MIRFATYH ZAKIYEV, Origin of Turks and Tatars. Part 1. Origin of Turks. Second chapter. Detection methods for the ethnic roots of the Turks. Primary sources and historical works. In researching the problems of an origin of ethnosis, special value had the discovery of their most ancient ethnical roots. But at present no method is developed, neither in the historical linguistics nor in the historical anthropology, for this purpose. This chapter will try to show at least some ways of the detection of the ethnical roots of the Turks. First of all, there is a problem of finding and assessing the primary sources. Every ethnos, during its rise and development, leaves a trace. Somewhere and somehow remain things made by it or kept, are passed from one generation to another, the methods of producing material goods, opinions which find expression in folklore, and the burials are left remains of the members of the ethnos, are found burial traditions, and at last remains its greatest invention, a language. These traces of the tribes are objective primary sources for study of their history in the pre-literature period. These sources are not to be studied by the historical and ethnical linguistics, archaeology, ethnology, mythology, historical folklorists, historical osteology, craniology, and anthropology as a whole on the background of zoopaleontology, paleogeology, and paleogeography. After invention of writing, people who learned this greatest achievement of humanity started recording diverse information about themselves, their people, their neighbors in writing. Eventually came a custom of writing chronicles, where information about major events happening with them or their neighbors. About the ancient history of Turks, some of the above records can be taken from Chinese, Indian, Greek, Assyrian, Jewish, Roman, Byzantine, Armenian, Arabian, Persian, Turkic, and Russian written sources. But their study should be taken with a caveat that they cannot be completely and unconditionally objective, for the records are written as a rule from a subjective point of view of the chronographer. This especially relates to the evidence about neighbors. But despite that, the ancient written sources are historical sources alongside with the linguistical, archaeological, ethnological, anthropological, zoological, geological, and geographical sources. In the ethnogenesis, there are also termed primary sources. In study of the ancient history of any people in detecting its ethnic roots, in addition to the above sources, a big value also have historical works, which cannot be classed as primary sources. The first historical works about the history of their and not only their peoples were created by the historians who found and studied the primary sources. It's known that a historian, as much as he tried to create an objective picture of the history, brings on the foreground the most full reconstruction of the history first his people, and the history of other people serves as a rule as a general background for a better display of his own history. Therefore, in the initially examined historical works, which base on the analysis of primary sources, a display of subjectivity should not be surprising to anybody. Many historical studies are written based on the study of not only the primary sources of the historical sources, but also based on the study of the historical works. In these studies, not only the discoveries but also the mistakes of the predecessors are frequently repeated. As a result of repeating the mistakes of the predecessors, and the traditional historiography began to be taken as axioms and very propagated in the subsequent works, such mentioned above with generalizations as doctrines of the great movement of peoples, that movement was begun by the Huns, that before the great movement of peoples in the Eastern Europe were not Turks, that Turks were nomads only, that Turks were Mongolians only, that nomadic Turks taught the Turkic language to non-Mongolians and then disappeared from the face of the earth, etc. Every scientist engaged in the history of Turks, like in other peoples, should analyze by all means, alongside with the study of the primary sources, the conclusions given in the historical works. For in first, the primary sources from the point of the reflection of any episodes of the Turkic history until now are studied totally insufficient. Secondly, many ancient Turkic ethnonyms found in the primary sources are classed by the modern historians of other ethnoses, and the contents of the primary sources are not always adequately commented on, and thirdly, not always is accounted for the ideas of particular messages in the written primary sources. In other words, the basic sources of study of the ethnic roots of Turks are the primary sources, and the historical works play a supporting role. Therefore, the attitude to them should always be careful.